The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of rubber trees, casting dappled shadows across the muddy pathways that crisscrossed the plantation in southern Thailand. Michael Thompson, a 45-year-old agricultural engineer from Ohio, had been working at this remote farm for 3 years, helping to modernize their irrigation systems and crop management techniques. His bright orange safety shirt, a requirement on the worksite, had become as much a part of his daily uniform as the worn khaki shorts and steel-toed boots that carried him through the humid Southeast Asian landscape. The air hung thick with moisture from the previous night's monsoon rains, and Michael could feel sweat already beginning to bead on his forehead as he made his morning rounds. The wet season had been particularly brutal this year, turning the normally manageable dirt roads into treacherous mud tracks that trapped vehicles and made transportation nearly impossible. Local farmers had reported unusual animal activity: elephants, tigers, and other wildlife venturing closer to human settlements as their natural habitats flooded. Michael was examining a damaged irrigation pipe near the eastern boundary of the plantation when he first heard it, a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a desperate, heart-wrenching trumpet call, high-pitched and filled with terror. The sound cut through the humid air like a knife, carrying with it an urgency that made his blood run cold. He had heard elephants before during his time in Thailand, but this was different. This was the cry of something in mortal danger. Following the sound through a grove of young rubber trees, Michael pushed aside hanging branches and stepped over fallen logs, his boots squelching in the soft earth. The trumpeting grew louder and more frantic with each step, joined now by what sounded like violent splashing and the deep groaning of wood under stress. When he finally emerged into a small clearing, the scene before him stopped him in his tracks. A baby Asian elephant, no more than 3 months old by Michael's estimation, was trapped in what had once been a small pond, but was now a pit of thick, viscous mud. The recent rains had turned the watering hole into a death trap, and the young calf had obviously ventured in during the night to drink only to become hopelessly mired in the clinging sediment. The little elephant's gray skin was completely caked with brown mud, making it difficult to distinguish where the animal ended and the marsh began. The sight was both heartbreaking and terrifying. The calf's trunk waved frantically above the surface, the only part of its anatomy that remained completely free of the sucking mud. Its small eyes, wide with panic, darted around the clearing as if searching for its mother or any sign of help. Each movement seemed to drive the young elephant deeper into the mire, and Michael could see that exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. The trumpeting calls were becoming weaker, more desperate. Michael's mind raced as he assessed the situation. The calf appeared to be sinking slowly but steadily, already submerged up to its shoulder line. The mud had the consistency of thick concrete, and he could see that any rescue attempt would be extremely dangerous for both the animal and anyone trying to help. But more concerning was the absence of the mother elephant. Adult female Asian elephants are notoriously protective of their young and rarely venture far from their calves. The fact that this baby was alone suggested either abandonment, highly unusual for elephant social structure, or that something terrible had happened to the mother. The first thing Michael needed to do was call for help, but his satellite phone showed no signal in the dense forest clearing. The plantation's main office was over 2 miles away, and by the time he could return with assistance, the calf would likely be dead. The young elephant's struggles were becoming increasingly feeble, and Michael realized that if he didn't act immediately, he would be watching a magnificent creature die before his eyes. Stripping off his orange safety shirt and boots, Michael waded into the edge of the mud pit. The sensation was horrifying. The thick sludge immediately grabbed at his legs, trying to pull him down with the same relentless force that held the elephant captive. Each step required tremendous effort, and he quickly understood why the calf had become so hopelessly trapped. The mud seemed alive, a malevolent force that clung to everything it touched. The rescue that followed would later be described by wildlife experts as either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, possibly both. Working slowly and methodically, Michael began the painstaking process of digging around the elephant calf's body, scooping away handfuls of thick mud with his bare hands. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Several times he nearly lost his footing and had to grab onto the elephant's back to prevent himself from being pulled under. The baby elephant seemed to understand that help had arrived. Rather than struggling against Michael's presence, the calf remained as still as possible, occasionally touching Michael's arm gently with the tip of its trunk as if to acknowledge his efforts. This simple gesture, this moment of communication between two very different species, created an instant bond that would define both their lives for years to come. Hours passed in this manner. The sun climbed higher, turning the clearing into a humid oven. Michael's hands were raw and bleeding from the constant digging, his back ached from bending over the trapped animal, and dehydration was beginning to make him dizzy. But still, he continued, driven by something deeper than mere compassion, a primal need to save this innocent life. The breakthrough came when Michael managed to create enough space around the calf's rear legs to begin working them free. Using a combination of lifting and pulling, while the elephant pushed with whatever strength remained, they slowly began to make progress. The young calf's front legs emerged first, then its torso, until finally, with a sound like a massive suction cup being released, the baby elephant broke free from its muddy prison. The moment of liberation was both triumph and terror. The calf, suddenly free but weak from hours of struggle, stumbled and nearly fell back into the mud. Michael caught the small elephant, weighing perhaps 200 pounds, and helped guide it to solid ground. Both rescuer and rescued collapsed on the grass at the edge of the clearing, gasping and covered head to toe in thick brown sludge. But their ordeal was far from over. As Michael lay beside the exhausted calf trying to catch his breath, a new concern began to gnaw at him. Where was the mother elephant? In all his reading about Asian elephant behavior, he had never encountered a situation where a calf this young would be separated from its mother for so long. Adult elephants can travel great distances, but they never abandon their young, especially in dangerous situations. As the hours passed and no adult elephant appeared, Michael was forced to confront a heartbreaking reality. The mother was not coming back. Whether she had been killed by poachers, fallen victim to a vehicle strike on one of the busy highways that crisscrossed the region, or simply died from natural causes, her baby was now completely alone in the world. The little elephant that he had pulled from the mud was now an orphan, with no knowledge of how to survive in the wild and no family to teach it the complex social behaviors essential to elephant society. The sun was beginning to set when Michael finally made the decision that would change both their lives forever. The plantation was too far to carry the weak calf, and leaving it alone in the forest overnight would be a death sentence. Predators, exposure, or simple dehydration would claim the young elephant within hours. There was only one choice. He would have to stay with the calf through the night and figure out what to do in the morning. Using his orange shirt as a makeshift blanket, Michael created a small shelter against a fallen log. The baby elephant, seeming to understand that this strange human was its only hope for survival, curled up as close to Michael as possible. The physical contact seemed to comfort the calf, and gradually its breathing became less labored. Its trembling subsided. As darkness fell over the Thai forest, Michael found himself in a situation he never could have imagined. An American engineer, thousands of miles from home, serving as a surrogate mother to an orphaned elephant calf in the middle of a jungle. The responsibility was overwhelming, but as he felt the young elephant's warm body pressed against his side, breathing steadily in exhausted sleep, Michael knew there was no turning back. The transformation had begun. What started as an act of emergency rescue was evolving into something much deeper, a bond between species that would challenge everything Michael thought he knew about animals, about himself, and about what it means to truly care for another living being. Dawn broke over the rubber plantation with the usual symphony of tropical birds and the distant hum of insects beginning their daily routines. Michael woke to find the baby elephant's trunk draped across his chest, the calf's breathing deep and regular against his side. In the soft morning light, freed from the coating of mud that had obscured its features the day before, the young elephant revealed itself to be a perfect miniature of its magnificent species. Wrinkled gray skin, intelligent dark eyes, and impossibly expressive trunk that seemed to examine everything with scientific curiosity. The immediate challenge facing Michael was basic survival. The calf hadn't eaten in at least 24 hours and showed signs of dehydration. Baby elephants in the wild depend entirely on their mother's milk for the first several months of life, gradually transitioning to vegetation under careful maternal guidance. Without access to elephant milk or specialized formula, Michael faced the terrifying prospect of watching his rescued charge slowly starve. His first attempt at feeding involved a mixture of water and condensed milk from the plantation's emergency supplies offered in a large bottle typically used for feeding calves on the farm. The baby elephant showed no interest whatsoever in the artificial nipple, turning its head away and making small, distressed sounds whenever Michael tried to encourage it to drink. Hours passed with mounting frustration and growing fear. The calf was becoming visibly weaker, and Michael realized that his rescue efforts might prove meaningless if he couldn't solve the feeding problem. It was the elephant who taught Michael the solution. As he sat beside the increasingly listless calf trying to think of alternatives, the young elephant reached out with its trunk and began exploring Michael's hands with delicate precision. The touch was incredibly gentle, almost reverent, as the tiny trunk investigated every line and callus on Michael's palm. When Michael cupped his hands together and filled them with the milk mixture, the elephant immediately understood using its trunk to suck the liquid directly from this improvised feeding system. This breakthrough marked the beginning of an extraordinary learning process for both species. Michael discovered that baby elephants eat almost continuously, requiring feeding every 2 to 3 hours around the clock. The plantation became their temporary home, with Michael constructing a simple shelter near the equipment storage area where he could monitor the calf while still maintaining some semblance of his work responsibilities. The transformation in their relationship was remarkable to witness. Within days, the elephant calf had formed an intense attachment to Michael that went far beyond simple dependency. The young animal refused to be separated from its human caregiver for more than a few minutes at a time, becoming visibly distressed whenever Michael moved out of sight. This behavior, known as imprinting, typically occurs between elephant calves and their mothers, creating a psychological bond essential for learning and survival. Michael's daily routine completely reorganized itself around the elephant's needs. His mornings began before dawn with the first feeding, followed by a careful health check that had become as natural as examining his own reflection in the mirror. The calf would stand patiently, while Michael looked for signs of injury or illness, occasionally reaching out with its trunk to touch his face or hands in what seemed like reciprocal concern. The sight of a grown American man walking across a Thai rubber plantation, followed by a baby elephant, became a daily spectacle that drew visitors from neighboring farms. The image was both amusing and touching. Michael, in his characteristic orange shirt and khaki shorts, moving purposefully between irrigation systems and equipment installations, while a gray shadow no taller than his waist maintained perfect formation. Behind him, trunk occasionally reaching forward to touch the back of his legs, as if for reassurance. The elephant's intelligence became apparent almost immediately. Within a week, the calf had learned to respond to Michael's movements and gestures, seeming to understand the rhythm of his workday. When Michael stopped to examine equipment, the elephant would find a shady spot nearby and wait patiently. When he moved to a new location, the calf would rise and follow without any verbal command or physical encouragement. Feeding times evolved into elaborate rituals that spoke to the depth of their connection. The elephant would approach feeding with what could only be described as ceremonial behavior, first touching Michael's hands with its trunk, then positioning itself precisely for optimal access to the milk mixture. After feeding, the calf would often rest its head against Michael's chest, a gesture of contentment and trust that never failed to move him. The challenges of caring for a wild animal in a human environment became increasingly complex as the elephant grew stronger and more active. The calf's natural curiosity led to numerous adventures that tested both Michael's patience and his problem-solving skills. Irrigation pipes became toys to be investigated and occasionally damaged. Equipment storage areas transformed into exploration zones where every tool and machine required thorough trunk-based examination. Most challenging were the nights. Baby elephants in the wild sleep in close physical contact with their mothers and the extended family group. Deprived of this natural comfort, the calf initially experienced severe separation anxiety whenever Michael attempted to sleep in his own quarters. The solution required creativity and compromise. Michael moved his sleeping area to the equipment shelter, creating a space where both he and the elephant could rest in proximity while maintaining some boundaries. The bond between them deepened with each passing day. Michael found himself learning to read the elephant's moods and needs with increasing accuracy, while the calf seemed to develop an almost supernatural ability to sense Michael's emotional state. On days when work frustrations left Michael tense or distracted, the young elephant would approach with extra gentleness, sometimes simply standing beside him with one small foot touching his leg as if offering comfort. Local veterinarians and wildlife experts who examined the calf were unanimous in their amazement at the animal's health and behavioral development. Despite the traumatic circumstances of its rescue and the artificial nature of its care, the baby elephant was thriving physically and psychologically. The attachment to Michael, while unusual, appeared to be providing the emotional security necessary for normal development. But this success story came with mounting practical complications. As the elephant grew larger and stronger, gaining weight rapidly on its improved diet, the limitations of plantation life became increasingly obvious. The calf's natural behaviors were emerging, including a tendency to test boundaries, explore dangerous areas, and occasionally display the stubborn independence characteristic of its species. Michael's work performance began to suffer as more of his time and attention was diverted to elephant care. The plantation owners, while sympathetic to the unusual situation, made it clear that long-term accommodation of a wild animal was not feasible. Insurance concerns, safety issues, and the simple logistics of managing both agricultural operations and elephant husbandry were becoming untenable. More concerning were the signs that the elephant was beginning to outgrow its surrogate family structure. The calf showed increasing interest in distant sounds that might indicate the presence of other elephants. Its behavior during these moments, alert, focused attention combined with soft vocalizations, suggested an instinctive recognition that something was missing from its social environment. Wildlife behaviorists explained to Michael that elephant calves learn essential survival skills through interaction with their extended family groups. Complex behaviors like food selection, social communication, danger recognition, and mating rituals could not be taught by a human caregiver, no matter how dedicated. The elephant was approaching an age where these lessons would become critical for its long-term survival and psychological well-being. Michael found himself caught between competing emotions and responsibilities. The elephant had become as central to his daily existence as breathing or eating. The thought of separation created a physical ache in his chest that he had never experienced before. Yet he was beginning to understand that his love for the animal might require the most difficult decision of his life: letting go for the sake of the elephant's future. The realization came gradually built through countless small moments of observation and growing awareness. When the elephant showed excitement at the distant sound of wild elephants calling across the valley. When it displayed natural behaviors, like dust bathing and branch breaking, that had never been taught or demonstrated. When veterinarians gently explained that continued human dependency could permanently damage the animal's ability to integrate with its own species. Michael was evolving from rescuer to surrogate parent and now faced the prospect of becoming something even more difficult: a loving guardian willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for his charge's well-being. The elephant that had followed him across the plantation paths, slept beside his bed, and learned to find comfort in his presence, deserved a life among its own kind, no matter how much that separation would cost both of them. 6 months had passed since that desperate morning when Michael pulled a dying elephant calf from the mud pit, and the transformation in both their lives had been remarkable. The baby elephant, now approaching 400 pounds and standing nearly 3 feet tall at the shoulder, had grown from a helpless victim into a vibrant, healthy young animal whose intelligence and personality seemed to expand with each passing day. The bond between human and elephant had deepened beyond anything Michael could have imagined, creating a relationship that challenged conventional understanding of interspecies connection. But with growth came an increasingly complex set of challenges that could no longer be ignored or managed through creative solutions. The elephant's natural behaviors were asserting themselves with growing intensity, creating situations that ranged from amusing to genuinely dangerous. The calf's strength, while still that of a baby by elephant standards, was more than sufficient to damage equipment, knock down barriers, and occasionally pose risks to human safety. More troubling were the psychological signs that the young elephant was beginning to experience what wildlife behaviorists term social dysphoria, a form of distress that occurs when highly social animals are isolated from their own species during critical developmental periods. The calf showed increasing restlessness, particularly during evening hours when wild elephant herds were most active in the surrounding forest. Its trunk would lift high into the air, testing for scents and sounds that Michael's human senses couldn't detect, and its body language conveyed an unmistakable sense of longing. The decision point came during a consultation with Dr. Siraporn Thanakit, Thailand's leading expert in elephant behavior and rehabilitation. Dr. Thanakit had been monitoring the calf's progress since the early weeks after the rescue, initially impressed by the animal's rapid recovery and the unusual strength of its bond with Michael. But her latest evaluation carried a sobering message that Michael had been dreading but knew was inevitable. Dr. Thanakit explained that elephant calves begin learning critical social behaviors between 6 and 12 months of age, skills that can only be acquired through interaction with other elephants. These include complex communication patterns involving subsonic vocalizations, hierarchical behavior within herd structures, recognition of danger, signals from adults, and most importantly, the development of species-appropriate social bonds that would eventually enable mating and successful reproduction. The elephant sanctuary that Dr. Thanakit recommended was located in northern Thailand, about 8 hours from the plantation by truck. The facility specialized in caring for orphaned and rescued elephants, with a particular focus on preparing young animals for eventual reintegration with wild herds. The sanctuary maintained several family groups of elephants in semi-natural conditions, including adult females who had previously served as surrogate mothers to orphaned calves. The process, Dr. Thanakit explained, would not be simple or immediate. The calf would first need to undergo a gradual transition period, learning to accept care from elephant caregivers while slowly reducing dependence on Michael. This process typically took several weeks and could be emotionally traumatic for animals who had formed intense bonds with human caretakers. Some elephants experienced a form of grief during this transition that was heartbreaking to witness, but essential for their long-term well-being. Michael's immediate reaction was denial. The elephant was healthy, happy, and thriving under his care. Why disrupt a relationship that was working so well for both of them? But as Dr. Thanakit continued to explain the long-term consequences of prolonged human dependency, Michael was forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about his motivations and the elephant's actual needs. The elephant's attachment to Michael, while touching and apparently beneficial in the short term, was potentially damaging to its psychological development. Young elephants who bonded exclusively with humans during their early months often struggled to form appropriate relationships with their own species later in life. Some became permanently isolated from elephant society, unable to communicate effectively or understand social cues that were essential for survival in the wild. More challenging was Dr. Thanakit's gentle suggestion that Michael's own emotional attachment might be influencing his judgment about what was best for the elephant. The satisfaction and sense of purpose that came from caring for the orphaned calf was understandable and commendable, but it needed to be balanced against the animal's long-term welfare requirements. The conversation forced Michael to examine his relationship with the elephant from a new perspective. How much of his resistance to separation was genuinely based on concern for the animal's well-being, and how much was rooted in his own emotional needs? The elephant had filled a void in his life that he hadn't even realized existed, providing companionship, purpose, and unconditional affection that had become central to his daily happiness. The decision process consumed several sleepless weeks, during which Michael found himself observing the elephant's behavior with new awareness. He began to notice signs of frustration and restlessness that he had previously dismissed or rationalized. The calf's intense focus on distant elephant sounds, its increasing tendency to test boundaries and challenge restrictions, and most tellingly, its apparent excitement when encountering elephant dung or scent traces left by wild herds passing through the plantation area. The breakthrough in Michael's thinking came during an encounter with a wild elephant herd that ventured onto plantation property during a particularly dry period. The elephants were seeking access to the irrigation water sources, and Michael's first concern was protecting his charge from potential danger. Adult wild elephants could be unpredictable around humans and might view the orphaned calf as a threat or competitor. But the young elephant's reaction to seeing its own species for the first time since the rescue was impossible to ignore or misinterpret. The calf became intensely animated, vocalizing with sounds Michael had never heard before and displaying body language that spoke of recognition, excitement, and deep longing. When the wild herd moved away after drinking their fill, the young elephant attempted to follow, calling repeatedly and showing signs of genuine distress when Michael prevented it from leaving. That night, as Michael sat beside the visibly agitated calf, he finally accepted what Dr. Thanakit had been trying to tell him. His love for the elephant, if it was genuine love rather than selfish attachment, required him to make the most difficult sacrifice imaginable, giving up the relationship that had become the center of his emotional life for the sake of the animal's future happiness and well-being. The preparation for separation took 3 weeks and was the most emotionally challenging period of Michael's life. Working with sanctuary staff, he began gradually reducing the elephant's dependence on his constant presence, encouraging the calf to spend increasing amounts of time with Thai elephant handlers who would eventually take over its care. These men and women experienced in working with orphaned elephants understood both the behavioral needs of the animals and the emotional trauma experienced by human caretakers facing separation. The elephant's response to this transition process was heartbreaking to witness. Initially confused by the reduction in Michael's attention and presence, the calf showed signs of depression and anxiety that mirrored human reactions to abandonment. It refused food for several days, became listless and withdrawn, and would stand for hours at the edge of its enclosure trunk extended toward wherever Michael had last been seen. But gradually, with patient encouragement from the Thai handlers and carefully structured interactions with other elephants at a nearby holding facility, the calf began to show interest in its new environment and caretakers. The moment when it first touched trunks with an adult female elephant, a gesture of greeting and social recognition, marked the beginning of its psychological transition from human-dependent orphan to elephant society member. The day of final separation was scheduled for early morning when travel conditions would be optimal and both Michael and the elephant would be in the calmest possible state. The sanctuary transport truck arrived at dawn equipped with a specially designed enclosure that would keep the elephant secure and comfortable during the journey north. Loading the elephant into the transport proved to be an ordeal that tested everyone's emotional resilience. The calf seemed to understand that something significant was happening and became increasingly distressed as the loading process continued. It repeatedly called for Michael, reaching toward him with its trunk and showing clear signs of panic and confusion. Michael's temptation to call off the entire process was overwhelming. The elephant's obvious distress felt like betrayal of the trust and affection that had developed between them over the past months. Every instinct told him to comfort the animal, to promise that everything would be all right, to maintain the relationship that had brought both of them such happiness. But the sanctuary staff experienced in managing these difficult transitions, gently but firmly, encouraged Michael to complete the separation process. They explained that partial separations or false starts typically caused more trauma than clean, decisive action. The elephant needed to understand that the relationship was changing permanently, not temporarily. The truck pulled away from the plantation with Michael standing alone in the red dust of the access road, watching until the vehicle disappeared around a distant curve. The silence that followed was absolute. No sound of small elephant feet following behind him, no gentle trunk touches seeking reassurance, no soft breathing beside his sleeping area at night. The emptiness was physically painful, a hollow ache in his chest that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker as the days passed. For the first 2 weeks after the separation, Michael received daily reports from sanctuary staff about the elephant's adjustment process. The initial reports were concerning. The calf had refused food for several days, showed signs of depression and withdrawal, and repeatedly called with sounds that the handlers recognized as distress vocalizations specifically directed toward absent human caretakers. But gradually, positive changes began to emerge. The elephant started showing interest in other young elephants at the facility, began eating regularly when food was offered by elephant handlers rather than humans, and most importantly, started responding to the complex social communications of the adult female who had been selected as its potential surrogate mother. 6 months after the separation, Michael received an invitation from Dr. Thanakit that both thrilled and terrified him. The opportunity to visit the sanctuary and observe his former charge's progress. The invitation came with warnings and conditions. The visit would be brief, conducted from a distance that prevented direct interaction, and structured to avoid disrupting the elephant's ongoing socialization process. The journey to northern Thailand felt like traveling to another lifetime. Michael had continued his work at the plantation, but the absence of the elephant had left a void that no amount of professional activity could fill. His daily routines felt mechanical and purposeless without the constant presence of the animal that had transformed his understanding of compassion and responsibility. The sanctuary itself was a revelation. Hundreds of acres of natural forest and grassland where elephants moved in family groups that closely resembled wild herds. The facility's philosophy emphasized minimal human intervention, allowing the animals to develop natural behaviors and social structures while providing veterinary care and protection from external threats. Finding his former charge among the dozens of elephants at the sanctuary took several minutes of careful observation. When Michael finally spotted the young elephant, now significantly larger and moving with the confident gait of a healthy adolescent, the emotional impact was overwhelming. The animal that had once followed him everywhere, slept beside his bed, and learned to find comfort in his touch, was now integrated into a group of young elephants under the watchful supervision of 2 adult females. The moment of recognition was unmistakable. Despite the months of separation and the dramatic changes in the elephant's social environment, it immediately detected Michael's scent and presence. The reaction was instant and dramatic. The young elephant broke away from its group and moved directly toward the observation area where Michael stood behind a protective barrier. What followed was a reunion that captured the complex emotions of love loss and letting go that define the deepest human relationships. The elephant approached the barrier and reached through with its trunk, touching Michael's hands and face with the same gentle precision he remembered from their months together. The recognition was clearly mutual and profound, but equally clear was the change in the elephant's demeanor and priorities. After several minutes of trunk contact and what could only be described as conversation through touch and scent, the elephant stepped back and looked directly at Michael with an expression that seemed to convey both gratitude and closure. Then, in a gesture that Michael would replay in his memory for years to come, the young elephant turned and walked back to its elephant family group, where it was immediately welcomed with trunk touches and vocalizations from its adoptive herd. The message was clear and heartbreaking and beautiful all at once. The elephant remembered Michael maintained affection for him and acknowledged the debt of gratitude for rescue and care. But its life was now centered on relationships with its own species connections that would provide the social foundation necessary for a successful adult life. The desperate dependent attachment that had once bound them together had evolved into something healthier but more distant, fond memory rather than daily necessity. As Michael watched his former charge interact with other young elephants displaying behaviors and vocalizations he had never seen during their months together, he finally understood the wisdom of the decision he had fought so hard against. The elephant was not just surviving in its new environment, it was thriving in ways that would never have been possible under human care, no matter how loving or dedicated.